of the conference. My name is Tamara Anderson, and I'm a Senior Political Affairs Officer and Head of the Knowledge Management and Strategic Support Section in the Policy Branch of UNOCT. For those unfamiliar, UNOCT is a relatively new entity within the UN, so it was established in 2017. It was established by Secretary General Antonio Guterres to provide policy leadership on the General Assembly counter-terrorism mandates, to enhance coordination and coherence of the UN CTPVE efforts, and also to provide capacity building and technical assistance to member states. We also are the Undersecretary General, who is the head of UNOCT, is the primary advisor on counterterrorism to the Secretary General, and we are the focal point for the plan of action to prevent violent extremism. So it's within this context that our office and also those of our key partners remain seized of this central question of how we at the UN collect and collate data on terrorism to meaningfully operationalize it in our work. So I'm very pleased to be joined by key partners in this, the Institute for Economics and Peace, hopefully online, the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism. I'll go by the French acronym of CRAF'd, and also the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Director, CTED. But before I introduce our panelists, I'd just like to say a few remarks or reflections from UNOCT about the collection of data. So despite the territorial defeat of Daesh with the fall of Baghouz in 2019, terrorism remains a threat to international peace and security. The Secretary General has noted in his last assessment that the threat of terrorism remains geographically more diffuse and ideologically more diverse over time. Evolutions in terrorist capacities, targeting, methodologies, and territorial spread, particularly, for example, the exploitation of existing conflicts in the Sahel or areas in countries of Africa, continue to challenge our collective ability to respond to the threat. And data plays a critical role in addressing this complex and multifaceted challenge. Robust, credible data is essential for us to design effective responses at the UN that are appropriate and are effective at addressing the evolving nature of this challenge. Data also allows us to prioritize our resources and our efforts. Data and trend analysis can tell us not only the number and type of terrorist attacks that are rising or increasing in a given area. It helps us to identify, track, and analyze the changing methodologies employed, such as new narratives or new propaganda or recruitment techniques, the application of different technologies for fundraising, or for funding attacks, such as the use of cryptocurrencies. It can tell us about the changes and shifts in leadership or organizational structures of the different terrorist groups. And it can also tell us how effectively or if these groups are using new tools for attacks, such as drones or chemical or weapons of mass destruction, etc. So earlier this morning, we heard about a lot of challenges that we have in collecting this conflict-related data. And a lot of these are the same when we're looking at collecting data on terrorism. So we have challenges of standardization of data structures, common quality standards, common nomenclature and tagging methodologies, etc. And I think we've gone into a lot of detail of that in the morning. So what way is it different for terrorism data? This is the question that we want to focus on. I think for us, within the UN, the counterterrorism architecture is kind of playing catch-up when it compares to different conflict data, and this is for several reasons. The first being that until relatively recently, information on terrorists and terrorist activity was largely held in the domain of member states and their intelligence services, or it was shared bilaterally or through intelligence sharing agreements. So this information was also often collected in support of operational or tactical decision-making within a particular member states. And so any data was actually tightly controlled and any sharing was strictly restricted. The second point is that, of course, there is still no agreed definition of terrorism at the international level. And this has the effect both of impacting the standardization of the data that we are all collecting, but also allowing arguably more space for politicization. If there's no one common definition of what terrorism is, It allows for the politicization, or as a colleague mentioned earlier, the potential weaponization of such data. And 3, as terrorism is moving to take place primarily in conflict zones, we also have the standard issue of access to information. And I think we're subject to the similar struggles as was raised by our colleagues in DPKO in terms of how do you collect data at the most local of levels. So these are some of the challenges I think that we need to grapple with at the UN. They're not easy challenges, but it's our job to do so. And so with these introductory thoughts, I would like to introduce our panelists. I will introduce them all, and then we'll go into 2 presentations and then some thoughts also from our UN colleague. So the first, I would like to introduce Mr. Michael Collins, the Executive Director for the Americas at IEP, who will brief on IEP's approach to data at the global level, particularly something we rely on very closely, which is the renowned Global Terrorism Index, now in its 10th year. We also have online Idris Lali, the Acting Director of CRAF'd, who will brief on trends observed at the regional level in Africa and some challenges and way forward. And importantly, he'll also touch on how CRAF'd works with the AU to make sure that data is integrated into policy and programming responses. And finally, we'll hear from Ms. Rachel Atley, who is the coordinator of the Political Analysis and Research Unit at CTED, who will brief on our engagement, CTED's engagement with member states to collect data to inform the work of the CTED and the Security Council's Counter-Terrorism Committee. After these presentations, we'll have about 20 minutes for an interactive discussion and questions from online and in the room. So with that, I will hand over to you, Michael. Please.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tamara. And is there a chance we could go ahead and stick the slides on? Thank you very much. So Tamara was kind enough to refer to the Global Terrorism Index, which is one of our core reports. As Tamara also noted, is now in our 10th year. What it does is measures the impact of terrorism globally. It covers about 163 countries currently. Touching on a couple of points that Tamara made regarding the definition, and we do have our own definition of terrorism, which we'll bring up on the screen in a moment. But we were having kind of sort of an informal conversation outside, and all of these words were mine. But, you know, and maybe this is a conversation that has been had on many occasions before, but, you know, when we label something as terrorism, it then creates, in many cases, the political sensitivities and considerations and reputation risks that we're discussing about, and of course, the UN would want to be subject to. So in many instances, you know, one should consider, although we ourselves will continue to use or leverage the definition of terrorism, how much added value does it actually bring when it comes to informing counterterrorism strategy? If we are able to still label violent incidents per perpetrated group, or alternatively per the group that is claiming ownership, that should provide us the same analytical tools for it to be leveraged in a variety of different ways, whether that is at the level of the UN or the US government, or alternatively nationally within a country as well. So anyway, just a core point there. I did want to bring up the methodology very quickly. Excellent, thank you very much. So you'll see that definition at the sort of the very top there, and probably I think today, during today's session, you may see similar definitions. I think most of them are going to be pretty parallel and complementary. We use the underlying data set that we use is the terrorism tracker. A couple of benefits there, and we've switched indicators over the last, data sets over the last 3 years. This one's updated daily. And also every single incident is manually vetted as well. So although there are distinct advantages to obviously AI and to logarithms that allow you to be able to kind of sort of narrow down information, having it vetted by a human, we consider, at least for the moment, continue to consider to be immensely important. What it looks at is measures incidents, injuries, deaths, and hostages. Those are sort of weighted according to what we deem to be the impact on human society. And then what we do is we actually combine that with its impact over the last 5 years, in a way trying to sort of recognize the long-lasting impact that an individual terrorist incident may have on a society over the long term. 9/11 is a very clear example of that, for example. Then what we do is we kind of sort of have a process of normalization and banding that allows us to be able to compare instances of terrorism across all countries. That produces the Global Terrorism Index. And then year on year, we throw a whole bunch of sort of socioeconomic data at it to be able to try and better understand some of the underlying trends and drivers, which is what we're going to get into next, please. A couple of sort of the relatively cool things. Cool is the wrong word, but the data allows us to do is, for example, some of this. Being able to see which are the deadliest terrorist groups currently, this is in the form of a trend, and which ones are gaining or deteriorating in influence. So a couple of interesting points perhaps from this graph. The Islamic State continues to be the most deadly organization in the world as of now. I think with regards to what's happening in the Middle East, that might involve quite a bit of change as it pertains to next year. But actually the point I'd like to make is that one of the things that we see is that most terrorist groups really cease to exist within the first year, right? And if not within the first two. So in 2007, there were just over 140 well-established terrorist organizations. Within 1 year, that was kind of down to half. And over the next 10 years, that was pretty much down to 20%. So the point I'm trying to make is that after that 10-year period, terrorist groups are so embedded within society that they're very difficult to be able to remove. So the Islamic State and Al-Shabaab would be potentially cases, and we can see that on this graph, which brings me, of course, to groups like JNIM and the Balochistan Liberation Army, which are kind of sort of beginning to get to that stage, right? They're still very small, but if you take the BLA, for example, that is the quickest growing terrorist organization in the world right now. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is overall deaths from terrorism, again, as a trend since 2007. I'd like to make just a couple of quick points here as another example of the kind of sort of analysis that we'd be able to get from something like the Global Terrorism Index. This is somewhat of an unfair comparison for the Sahel, because we're obviously comparing a whole region compared to individual countries here, but it does highlight the move of the epicenter of terrorism towards sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel specifically. And it also highlights for me also is that despite obviously being in the headlines and the overall impact that we feel as regards to Europe and North America, the amount of terrorism is really put in perspective in this overall graph here, that top tiny blue sliver that you see here. Next slide, please. Thank you. Great. It also enables us to be able to sort of classify different instances. So this is, for example, a breakdown of terrorism according to ideological, religious, or nationalist separative motives. It enables us to be able to break things down according to target as well, for example. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then, of course, be able to kind of sort of see what is the impact of terrorism, starting with the number of deaths in individual countries across the world. One of the reasons I've brought up this slide here is that, really it helps us visualize how the very large percentage of terrorist attacks globally happen in a very small amount of countries. So terrorism is concentrated. Over 85% of all deaths occur in these countries that you see here on the bottom. So once you have that kind of sort of top level data, you're then able to be able to overlay that with a variety of other circumstances. For example, here is an overlay of terrorist incidents, terrorist attacks, and then deaths, depending on the blackness of the color and the size of the circle, compared to measures of food insecurity, specifically in the Sahel. So as you can see, and this is something that we see through our broader analysis, including the Global Peace Index, is that conflict, terrorism, food security, water stress are all intimately intertwined. Next slide, please. And just to kind of sort of reiterate that point, on the left-hand side here, you have the 10 countries with the largest impact of terrorism, starting with Afghanistan. All of those countries either have food insecurity, large amounts of water stress, and coupled with low levels of resilience. We're going to delve into the resilience component a bit. Another thing that a lot of these countries have in common are high levels of conflict as well. So 80%, more than 80% of terrorist attacks happen in countries that already have high levels of conflict. 80% of terrorist attacks happen within 50 kilometers of a conflict. So although we definitely want to continue to look at the analytics specific to terrorism, and this is why the global terrorism exists, looking at the broader elements of conflict and the drivers of that can provide added value as well. Next slide, please. So our flagship report is actually called the Global Peace Index. This is a measure of peacefulness around the world, again, for 163 countries, please. These are some of the different indicators that we track. Now, interestingly, we started with the Global Peace Index. You can move to forward, thank you. We started with the Global Peace Index. The impact of terrorism is actually just one of the 23 indicators that we use in the Global Peace Index. It just happened to be particularly data rich, which enabled us to be able to create this into a separate report. But again, with the emphasis on trying to understand what are some of the CT strategies, looking at conflict as a potential window, right? As a preventative window, and I'll get to that in a second, of how we can identify where the next risks will be, conflict very much comes into play. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's something like the Global Peace Index allows us to do, well, kind of the obvious, which are the countries most in conflict. Next slide. Which are the countries that are deteriorating the most. But on the flip side of that, and perhaps more importantly for the kind of work that we do, is which are the countries that are most improving in peacefulness? Which are the countries that are most peaceful? So one of the things that this enables us to do, and this will bring me to my point in a second with regards to the resilience analytics, is to be able to then compare this with thousands upon thousands of different socioeconomic data sets to be able to see what is actually statistically correlated with these improvements in peacefulness. So this actually forms the basis of what would be the underlying counter-terrorism and even socioeconomic development strategy. Please, next slide. So some of you may potentially be familiar with this framework. It's called the Positive Peace framework. It's somewhat simplified to the nth degree. We call them the 8 pillars of positive peace here. But actually underneath this are over 500 different socioeconomic indicators that show those very strong correlations with improvements in peacefulness over time, including all of the same underlying elements that would drive terrorism as well. So from that perspective, the Positive Peace Framework and those underlying measures of resilience provide us a window, and a longer term window, to be able to identify where future instances of terrorism and conflict will occur. So one of the benefits of positive peace is that parallel to those countries that improve in these pillars progressively, you develop higher per capita income, higher measures of resilience, all things which inherently or organically counter terrorism, higher forms of resilience to not only things like, pandemics and natural disasters, but also individual terrorist attacks. For example, if you think about the terrorist attack in New Zealand, in Christchurch, New Zealand, not only one of the most peaceful countries in the world, but also very high levels of positive peace. A lot of societal mechanisms exist to be able to deal with the impacts of terrorist attacks. And then lastly, with regards to predictive modeling. So we're able to see through positive peace data, which are the countries that are likely to deteriorate in peacefulness over the next 10 years based on where they currently are. This enables us again to be able to identify particular windows of opportunity. Next slide, please. So in closing, and just in terms of some overall reflections, we do believe strongly that the Positive Peace Framework and the underlying analytics can contribute specifically as a counterterrorism strategy in a couple of ways. Local development efforts, specifically targeting things that would traditionally be considered CTs, such as recruitment and illicit economies. So one of the upcoming pieces of research that we have is specifically tied to terrorist groups and their control of the illicit economy. We tend to see that violence from terrorist organizations tends to be equally linked to ideological reasons as it is to control of their financial assets. And that often includes control of the territory where the illicit economies happen. The same can be said for states. So one of the upcoming pieces of research that we have, for example, is looking at the softer approach that someone like Niger has taken with regards to integrated systems of integrating groups, non-state actors, and local municipalities within regions with high instances of terrorism, for example, regions where there are artisanal gold mines in the Sahel, versus a sort of a monolithic approach that we would have seen in places like Mali, for example. And then secondly, with regards to Halo, another model that we're developing to be able to do scenario building that's specifically related to the counterterrorism and public security sphere. For example, building scenarios such as, this is one for Colombia, what would be the impact if we moved 30% of the police force to port inspection duties? Again, with the aim of tackling these illicit flows and the financing of terrorism. Excellent. I think I'm probably done for time, so I'll leave it there. Maybe if you could just press one more. Definitely ongoing definitional challenges. I think one of the first things that we need to do, and I think we all already strive to do, is of course the clarity and the filtering and transparency. So even if we have differing definitions of terrorism, being able to classify that and allowing people to be able to filter that information and provide transparency on the way that we're compiling the information is key if we're going to be able to get to a final answer on this. The data collection aspect, I'm not an expert in. I think everyone today was a lot more of an expert than I am. But I think we all agree that this is kind of the new not normal, and we're going to need to get used to it. terms of AI and how we leverage it at the Institute for Economics and Peace, we use it quite productively as it pertains to doing queries for our underlying data sets, again, looking at measures of resilience with our code. Definitely think there's a lot of potential with regards to behavioral insights. So delighted to hear that UNOCT is investing a lot of time and effort into this, as well as perceptions. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I think what's also interesting, what you touched on, is a lot of the positive peace indicators are also commensurate or matched with a lot of the prevention work as well that the UN is working on, and I know UNDP is speaking about and you'll touch on in your remarks. So I think that's something, how do we start to measure and use that data as well to inform our policies and programs is an interesting point. We'll turn now, I see that we have Kurt online. We have, in fact, Richard Appau, who is the systems analyst who is also the data expert for a lot of the work that they do. So I'm happy you are able to connect, Richard, and we'll pull up your presentation in just a second.
Okay, Tamara, I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry, I'm currently in Chad on a mission. I think Idris is also now arriving in Egypt for another mission. So the internet is quite bad, but I hope that I'll be able to finish. So you can put up my slides.
Perfect. We can hear you very well, Richard. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, so thank you very much. I actually have to step in to do this presentation for Idris. Actually, the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism, it's a mandated institution of the African Union. So basically, just like the UN, we are the African Union Center for Counter-Terrorism. And so all matters that's related to terrorism and violent extremism are with the center. And so we collect data on all the incidents because as per our mandate, we are supposed to collect data on the terrorist incident, terrorist groups, and then individuals that are supporting terrorism on the continent for purposes of the Peace and Security Council taking a decision. Please, you can move to the next slide. So basically, we have existed for about 20 years. And in these 20 years, we have taken data on terrorism and violent extremism. As I mentioned, based on our functioning modality as the technical agency of the African Union responsible for building African Union member state capacity. And so what we have been doing oftentimes is to do what we call the data-driven decision making, so that the decisions the AU member states make at the PSC level or the assembly level are backed by the data and the evidences on the ground. And so since 2014, we have religiously been taking data on violent extremism and terrorism. And we do this with a definition that we have, just like Michael mentioned. The definition of what constitutes terrorist act on the continent is based on what we call the 1999 OAU Convention on Preventing and Combating Terrorism. And so this is the basis of which all terrorism indicators or the data we collected on the continent are based on. And so oftentimes, our data is a little more different from some other people that are also taking data on the continent. That is probably because the OAU Convention actually also mandates member states to define what is terrorism on their continent. And so a lot of the situations that are occurring on the continent, and I'll give typical example here, between Nigeria and Cameroon, there was a group that is an Anglophone Cameroon called Separatists, Ambazonian group. The Cameroonian government declared their activities as a terrorist group. And so as part of our data, whenever we take data in Cameroon, we classify the attacks that are being done by the Ambazonian groups as terrorists. But when you go to Nigeria, the same thing is happening, which we call the IPOB, the indigenous people of Biafra, which is also doing virtually the same thing as Ambazonian groups are doing. But unfortunately, the Nigerian government has not declared that group as a terrorist group. And so the data we take does not include those people for Nigeria. So you see, that's the difficulty aspect about the data collection, the inconsistency in the definition of what constitutes terrorist act in some of the member states. And like somewhere January 2022, the Nigerian government decided that the activities of banditry around the northwestern and the north central state of Kaduna, Katsina, and then Zamfara are terrorist acts. So since then, we also began collecting those data and counting them as terrorists. So really, from definition perspective, it poses a lot of challenge about the data, because year-on-year comparison, it becomes difficult because the situation changes. Please move to the next slide. So, for example, this map you see is actually the situation that we witnessed on the continent last year. That is 2022. This data is compared to the data we took in 2021. And so when we compare this situation, you look at the places that are in red. That is the Egypt, that is Niger, that is Nigeria, and then that is Burkina Faso and Cameroon. You see Somalia, and then you see Mozambique. These areas, when we compare the 2022 data that we collected with the one we collected in 2021, we saw a resurgence in terrorist activities. That is for 2022 when compared to 2023. Then the next slides, we tried to, because we were in the mid of June when we did this map. So this is 2023 June. That's mid-year 2023 when it compared to mid-year 2022. So this year compared to last year, the previous map was last year compared to 2021. So when we compare the middle of this year to the middle of last year, we notice that the situation has changed a bit. So here you realize that the red in Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, has changed to mean that the attacks have declined. However, and then again, the red in Mozambique has also changed this year. So it means that the situation has both improved in Egypt and then improved also in Mozambique. But you notice that Mali situation has also changed to red. It means that when we compare the situation has become worse in Mali. And the situation in Niger has come down. And the attacks in Nigeria also come down when it's compared to both situations. So these maps are done for the continent based on the data that ACSRC takes in real time on a daily basis. Please move to the next slide. Yes. So basically, just like Michael explained their methodology, we have a way of collecting our data. So this cycle you see there is the ACSRC's own data collection methodology. So we have an in-house tool. We call it the Africa Media Monitor. It's more or less an machine learning tool that scans websites on the continent. We have fed it with some key indicators of certain indicators so that it scans through the website on 24/7 basis, because we run a situation room that operates 24/7. So the situation room groups take the data and we use to produce what we call daily news brief. From the daily news brief, our analysts then mine the data from the daily news brief of attack, counter-terrorism attacks. Of course, we don't count counter-terrorism as an attack. So the number of attacks that you see, it does not include counter-terrorism. And the number of deaths that we project, it does not also include counter-terrorism deaths. So the analysts do this, but we have a validation and verification process. All the African Union member states, the 55 African Union member states, are mandated to do what we call the focal point community. So we have focal point communities. It depends on what the country designates a focal point. In some countries, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In some countries, it's the intelligence. In some countries, the police. And in some countries, it's the military. So what they do is that these agents are responsible for counter-terrorism data in their country. So on regular basis, they send the data they have collected to us. And then when we also record incidents where the data is not clear, then we go back to them for them to verify that we saw that there was an attack in this area. So and so person was killed. Can you confirm this attack? They say no. This attack happened all right, but the number of deaths is not like that. For our methodology, the number that the member state actually provides is what we put into our database. So we have a database. When the numbers are verified and validated, then we clean the data and then we put in our database. Then from the database, we store it in the database, which is internal, but we make it available to our African Union member state, because the database also contains certain information about individuals and terrorist groups. And this information on regular basis on request, then we send to the member state for purposes of decision making. Then we conduct analysis based on the data in the database. Sometimes we do quarterly trend analysis, midterm trend analysis, and then we do yearly trend analysis. The difference here is that on regular basis, we are briefing the PSA. And so there are some reports that specifically we do, and then we give to the PSC. Those reports that are public for consumption is published on our website. And sometimes we also distribute them on our contact list. Please move to the next slide. So basically, like Michael mentioned them, and then I think that Tamara did mention in some of her introduction, there are a lot of challenges that we continue to face in our effort to collect the data. First of all, like I already mentioned, the understanding and common consensus on what act constitutes terrorism in our member state continue to be a challenge. On a daily basis, we are battling with it. We will see attack. We will look at all the ingredients of attack based on the OAU convention. We think that this actually meets every aspect of it. But immediately you do that, especially in countries where there was no attack and one attack happened, and we feel that it qualifies to be a terrorist attack. You see member states coming to say that, no, this is not a terrorist attack. It's some violence that took place and all that. So these are all challenges. And then again, differentiating between what is terrorism, what is violent extremism, and then what is armed conflict. This is a challenge in a lot of areas where the three issues are happening. Like, for example, in Mali or Burkina Faso, we have armed conflict taking place between communities. Then we have violent extremism happening, and then we have terrorism actually also happening. So in those cases, when the incident happens, even to the member state themselves, it becomes difficult in differentiating which of the act is a terrorist act, which of the act is a violent extremism, or which of them is intercommunal clashes. Sometimes also, the terrorist group cause attack that leads to communities carrying out reprisal attack. We have seen that in the Sahel a lot of time. So it becomes also difficult to us to classify whether the attack will be a terrorist attack or not. And then the ability to collect more to achieve an acceptable level of degree of accuracy. In as much as we are trying to collect the data, we feel that sometimes there are attacks that are happening, especially in remote areas, that are not reported either to the member states or we do not also receive them. And so sometimes we miss some of the incidents on the ground. And so now what we are trying to do is to come out with a community of bloggers and journalists, so that these journalists will be within communities. And we are also trying to put together some researchers in typical communities that write on issues of terrorism and violent extremism. So we will use them to show up our data so that we'll try as much as possible to meet. Another difficulty is that sometimes even validating data from member states could take so much an effort. And especially so because we are African Union institution. Like the UN, you wouldn't want to cause disaffection for member states. But in our attempt to verify data, sometimes it delays our process of data collection. And then again, another challenge we have noticed is the need to consolidate and making meanings of the numbers that are communicated. Oftentimes, we think that some terrorist groups actually inflate their data. Like, for example, Al-Shabaab. Just last month, they ambush an Ethiopian defense forces in Somalia. And according to Al-Shabaab, they killed 257 of Ethiopia soldiers. But the Ethiopian ambassador in Somalia said that, no, it is not true. They did not kill even a single soldier. Then, just about 3 days, the Ethiopian army announced that they killed 462 members of Al-Shabaab. Really, you would have to find out. 466 members of Al-Shabaab were killed. That is about a whole community in Somalia. So were they just sitting down and then they went to kill them? And is it possible that the military will engage Al-Shabaab in that battle, yet without killing even a single soldier? So you see, that is actually the difficulty. It might not be only terrorist group that inflate data. Sometimes we have seen instances where even those we go to verify the information are having data that become difficult. So in these cases, then we have to do a lot of other checks, including talking to community members to be able to have a clear understanding of what is issue. And finally, the issue of forests at the African Union. You see, the unfortunate part is that we are supposed to be academic within a political institution. And so the difficulty of being politically and diplomatically correct and at the same time being factually accurate is a challenge for us. Because sometimes you want to put a fact as it is. Then you will find out member state always being jittery. So always you see that sometimes in making presentation, we have to have a lot of back and forth with them. You mention something, they say that no, this is not happening. You will give them evidence that no, this is happening. And sometimes they even go to the extent of questioning, how do you find the information? Because you cannot tell them that you have people on the ground taking the data for you. It then appears that you are taking intelligence at their back. So these are all issues that we face in trying to ensure that we have accurate data for decision making on C2 on the continent. Please, next slide. So, I mean, these are all the challenges. The question is, how are we at these challenges? 3 issues come to mind here. Now, with respect to the definition of what constitutes terrorism, and because we don't want government to begin to label opposition groups and certain individuals that are expressing certain grievances as terrorist groups, we decided that there should be a subcommittee on counter-terrorism sitting at the African Union Peace and Security Council. And those groups will have the mandates of now declaring which group is a terrorist group or which group is not a terrorist group. So if any government wants to declare a group a terrorist group, send the list to the PSC. The PSC does investigation together with the technical expert. Then we agree that, okay, based on the modus operandi and how the group is operating, it can safely be declared as a terrorist group. Then we are also developing a mobile application to help us directly contact the member states so that they can share their information, because some member states have also raised concern about the security of the information they send and the medium of channel of communication. So this year, we started the development of mobile app that will allow us to directly communicate with all the focal points that we have in our member state so that information can seamlessly and then securely communicated to us. And then finally, we started a project this year. We've started training the algorithm. We want to see how the algorithm will behave because we want to use an AI tool to actually classify, detect, and then validate whether an attack that has been recorded in our AMM could be identified as a terrorist attack, or it cannot be identified as a terrorist attack. So we are looking at the degree of accuracy. I think from the training that we have seen about 60% accuracy. About 60% of the incident, the machine learning, the AI algorithm was able to detect that yes, indeed, it was a terrorist attack or it was a counter-terrorism attack because of how we feed the data. Please, the next slide. I think it's yes. This is the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think that was great and a very tangible insight into the challenge of actually having definitions of terrorism and how that actually can pose some challenges in and of itself, rather than kind of helping standardized data. So I think that was extremely insightful for us. Before going to questions, I'll now turn to Rachel to offer the perspective of CTED. Thanks, Richard. And thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Tamara. So I'm with the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate, we're known as CTED. So I'm just going to give you a quick introduction of what CTED is and does, and then I'll talk you through some of the challenges and opportunities for us to incorporate data into our work and the broader work of the United Nations. So CTED serves the Counter-Terrorism Committee of the United Nations Security Council. The committee was formed right after the 9/11 attacks. And it was formed from a Security Council resolution, which was adopted. It's legally binding on all United Nations member states. And it requires countries to prohibit terrorism and support to terrorism. And since then, there's been a bunch of other legally binding resolutions on all member states on a whole range of aspects of terrorism, like border security, passenger screening, foreign terrorist fighters, prevention of countering terrorist narratives. And so CTED's role is to travel to member states and conduct assessments and reviews of how they're going at implementing all of those Security Council resolutions, because they're quite high level and there's not really specifics in how countries are supposed to implement them. And different countries are going to have different views on how to implement something in their own country. So we conduct assessments and it takes about 5 to 10 days. send a big delegation and we review every aspect of a country's CT framework. And from that, we have our own unique, weird data set because we're conducting a review of their compliance and functionality with domestic counter-terrorism legislation, their criminal legal system, how they address recruitment, how they address terrorism financing. We look at border control, we look at how countries ensure a framework of protecting human rights while countering terrorism, and we look at international cooperation like mutual legal assistance. So we form this unique data set, and we're not investigators. We're talking directly to countries, and we're hearing from governments, although we do speak to civil society and others to make sure we've got a broad perspective. And our reports on individual countries are confidential. They have to be that way, otherwise countries wouldn't share all that information with us about their justice systems or what have you. So they have to be confidential. But despite that, despite the confidentiality of individual country assessments, we nonetheless see the value in publishing trends analysis and surveys and documents that highlight trends that we're seeing across regions or across the world or on thematic issues to highlight to our Counter-Terrorism Committee, but also to the broader member states on how member states are going and implementing CT resolutions and what their challenges they're facing, what we're seeing in common across the member states. So even though our reports are confidential, the Council does see it's really important to share, make efforts to bring to light that information. We do have nearly 2 decades of data that we've collected, so it's a priority for us to make sure we continue to share the trends that we're seeing. In addition to our own individual data set, we also try and look beyond that. We have a global research network, which is over 100 academic think tank research institutes that we partner with around the world, including IEP, including CRAF'd, who you've just heard from today. And we try and incorporate their research and their data analytics into our work. And we also do put them in front of members of the United Nations so they can present their research and their data so member states can incorporate that into their work to implement Security Council resolutions. So data is important to us. It's really central to our work, not just our own data, but the data that we incorporate from those in our global research network. And we try our best to put as much of that as we can in front of member states who we repeatedly tell we need them to form an evidence base in the work that they're doing. So in terms of our challenges, this is going to sound familiar. Our challenges are the same as those that have come up plenty of times today, that Tamara raised and Richard raised with you. Our primary challenge is definitional. Sometimes there's no definition at the United Nations terrorism, sometimes there's too many definitions, but either way, different member states will communicate with us about what they're doing differently based on how they view what terrorism is. And then to complicate that further, there are each member state will have their own domestic regime for designating terrorist groups, plus there's also a multilateral UN list of designated terrorists, and they're always going to be different. And there's also a definition problem we have with types of terrorism, and a good example of that is what the United Nations calls xenophobia, racism, and intolerance on the basis of religion or belief. Or others will call extreme right-wing or left-wing, or others will call racist, racially motivated violent extremism. And that's a really difficult thing for us to define and therefore analyze or track or identify threat, because many of the actors aren't actually aligned with any particular group, and quite a few of them have merging or overlapping or contradicting ideologies, so they're quite difficult to define or even track if the trend is going up or going down. We also really struggle with how to measure terrorism. Our mandate's really focused on terrorism which requires violence, but we also have to track the feeders and the trends that are going towards people's desire to conduct violence. But we also have to look at different member states' ways of measuring terrorism. So are they looking at extreme content online? Are they looking at referrals to hotlines? So if a member state is telling us that a particular type of terrorism is increasing or decreasing, we have to kind of determine whether they're talking about acts of violence or referrals or other ways that they're defining a terrorist threat. So we may see an increase in rhetoric or activity online, but at the same time, a decrease in violence. So how do we measure a terrorism trend? So some member states, for example, tell us that that XRIRB, that racially motivated extremism, is going up, but but what does that mean? Does that mean they're actually seeing a rise in attacks or activity, or does that mean something else? So now that I've presented you with the challenges, I think that the next step, I suppose, is in my narrative arc is to tell you what the solution is. That it's actually very difficult, and we had a chat in the lobby just now, and I guess that is it really is very difficult. But for us, I think the answer is to do this and more of this. We partner very closely with academia. I think IEP, I think Michael and Richard and Idris probably have lost count of the amount of times we've asked them to brief the United Nations and give them an update on their data and the research that they're seeing, because that's really important both for the UN to do its policy work, but also for member states to do theirs. And it's really important for us to continue to partner with UN agencies, particularly United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, to share that data. And I think more platforms like this will help us sharpen the way that we integrate data into our work more broadly at the United Nations. So that's why I'm very, very grateful for this forum today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all the speakers. I think, how long do we have?
So we definitely end at 5, but you can take the full hour.
When did we start? I think we have 10 minutes then.
Yeah.
I think we have 10 minutes if there's some follow-up questions. One thing I just wanted to start with is just to note that the Secretary General's data strategy calls on the UN to kind of establish common data governance across the UN entities, which I think is very ambitious. And I think these different presentations and the range of challenges show how challenging this could be. But I know within UNOCT and perhaps with CTED, we want to work at coming up with some common principles or some guidelines for how UN entities can work with the data that our key partners are providing and presenting to us, so that we can perhaps reassure member states how we're using it. We can, find ways to make it even more actionable or operational internally, rather than it kind of being something that's kept external that, experts come in and brief and then they go away. How can we actually make sure that we're using this data more meaningfully? And perhaps to start with, we could have some internal guidance that would help us to adapt that. Those are just some of my thoughts, but maybe I'll open the floor. We have small people in the room and some online, but I'd also encourage the participants, if you had questions or reactions of each other, to also please jump in as well. Yes, please.
Yusuf from UNDP. Thanks so much, Tamara and colleagues, for the presentation today. I guess jumping off your last comment, my question is, how do we communicate? And this was actually one of the questions that came up in another panel. How do we effectively communicate some of these analysis and findings with the government? And how do we then communicate back how the data has been used? I think this is also a challenge back to the civil society organizations, back to the communities which are being impacted by the data we collect. So, for example, if there was some sort of early action that was taking place, or some sort of policy change that was taking place based on the data analysis that, for example, CETA shared or another UN agency shared, is there a mechanism we can think about of getting that action results shared back to the communities that are being impacted? That's my question. I know it's no easy solution.
No, I think it's a great question. And maybe I might ask if Richard has any best practices from CAT as well, and then ask Rachel and Michael if they have any, because I think maybe Richard has some examples of how they do that.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Well, basically, Member states share data with us, and the data is actually used in communicating to the African Union on the development and trends in those particular countries. Because mind you, the member states a lot of time are requesting for capacity building assistance from the CAET. And so when we are going back to the principals for money to help those member states, we have to provide evidence as to what is happening. And then again, like my sister from the CTED mentioned, we also do sometimes ask for support from UNOCT, CTED, and even UNOCT, and then UNODC. We do a lot of things with them. So in requesting for these assistance on behalf of member states, we should be able to present the situation as it is on the grounds. So that because we do what we call the data-driven decision making at the AU level. And so through the PSC is able to come out with certain decisions to favor certain countries. What I even remember most is about the Lake Chad Basin. Due to the activities with there, the AU decided to have an African Union support mission to the Lake Chad Basin, the MNJTF. And that support mission has been carrying out a lot of capacity building workshop for the countries. So of course, the data comes, and then we also communicate the feedback to the countries giving us the data as to what we are using the data for. But I would also want to mention that, and that is another challenge we have realized, that on our part, some of the member states also even lack the capacity to be able to collect data and do the kind of analysis we do at the continental level, at the national level, so that they can also observe the trends. So a lot of those member states therefore then relies on the ACSRT for data even in their own countries, because we have the mechanism, we have the database. And so sometimes they can even write back to us to ask for the situation of the country, whether it is improving or improving, and what needs to be done at their level. And that in turn, they also help us with the validation and processes of the data, so that we have accurate data communicating to the situation in their countries.
Great, thank you, Richard. Rachel or Michael, do you have some additions on this?
So, yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One's kind of always sort of wary of talking about sort of the impact of some of this work, recognizing that there are so many other things that have kind of sort of come into play. But and I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. So, as it pertains to, say, the positive peace framework we were looking at earlier, the city of Culiacan in Sinaloa in Mexico has been leveraging that framework to be able to sort of fund and basically manage the different investments that they're making at the municipal level. This is via one of the major foundations there, to be able to help build positive peace. Now, the city and the broader municipality has been improving in peacefulness for 7 or 8 years now. Whether we would attribute that directly to something like the positive peace framework, well, that might be a bit of a stretch. I'd like to think so, but I wouldn't immediately claim it, although I do love to talk about it. For the more punctual that you get and the more granular you get, the more you can actually sort of attribute those forms of successes. So if I could share another example, specifically in Davao in the Philippines, fighting an insurgency for many, many years, implemented a program called 911, the basis of which was the positive peace framework. Among the various different socioeconomic and development activities that they did, there was one in particular which was kind of something along the lines that Richard was talking about, which was a very basic text and voice portal to be able to report instances of conflict, because there was very little ability to be able to track what's happening where, what are the movement of the insurgents, for example. That was actually used anecdotally, but critically, for 79 insurgents to actually surrender. So this was the first time that insurgents had access to a communication mechanism that enabled them to be able to safely demobilize, that wasn't essentially walking into a police station and God knows what happens since. So yes, when you do get to the very granular, you can sort of make those direct connections with any CP strategy or any particular initiative. When you're trying to get to the sovereign state level, it's much more difficult to do.
Yes, I certainly agree. I think that a two-way dialogue really is necessary. And I think that CTED does it, but it can be a little clunky. And I think the same probably applies to many parts of the United Nations, that we have a really active CSO engagement strategy, but we forget necessarily to have a direct feedback path. So I think sometimes we'll consult civil society or we'll consult academia and put their views into a process, and then there's probably silence. And then 6 months later we say, oh, we've got to, do an update with our academic partners or civil society, and we give them an update, but we kind of, it might not directly translate. So we do try, but it could be a little clunky. But we've learned a couple of things in recent years, I think we're learning from, or we've had two good examples of things that we're learning from. The first is that CETA has begun to publish a type of publication called Civil Society Perspectives. And instead of just doing our own research, or instead of just putting out trends from our own data, we're also giving a voice to civil society on specific trends or things that they're seeing in a region or on a theme. And we're going to do more of those to make sure that civil society is speaking directly to member states, and it's available for all member states to read and or all UN agencies to read and incorporate into their policy making. So we're going to do more of those. And the second one is that last year, the Counter-Terrorism Committee held a meeting in New Delhi, India, and that set a really high watermark for civil society, academia, and private sector engagement. We had, I can't tell you the numbers, but a huge amount of speakers and experts come and speak directly to the Counter-Terrorism Committee, and all the other member states that were invited to give their perspectives from around the world on new and emerging technologies, which is the theme of this Counter-Terrorism Committee meeting in New Delhi. So I think that we learnt from that just how positive that engagement can be when you have these experts speaking directly to member states who are then going to have to sit together and negotiate documents or processes on terrorism and counterterrorism. So that set a high watermark for us, and we learned a lot from that, and we hope to replicate it.
Great, thank you. And I think it's something we can keep exploring, in the UN system and with our partners. I see there's one question, but unfortunately we need to wrap up because I think security will Google security will come and kick us out. So thank you to all the panelists for this great conversation. Look forward to continuing more as we move ahead. And thank you to participants online. And thank you for joining us and being here. Thank you.
I missed that. I'm sorry.
My wife is fine.
That was a lot of backup.